Hello, everyone. My name is Nahed Mansour, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Education at the Gardner Museum. Welcome to our 3-work series. You will notice your mics and videos are muted and the chat option has been disabled. However, there will be a Q&A following today's conversation, and so we invite you to send us questions through the Q&A function at any point. Also, please note that this program is being recorded and live streamed through Facebook Live. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Toronto is located on the treaty lands and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation. The community we work in is the home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to learn and live on this land. Today, we're very excited to welcome Courtney M. Leonard as our guest speaker. She will be in conversation with Sequoia Miller, the Gardner Museum's Chief Curator. Today, Courtney will speak to works related to the theme of water. I'll now turn off my video and mic and hand it over to Sequoia.
Great, thank you, Nahed. Hello and welcome to everyone who's able to join us today, and a big welcome to you, Courtney. Thank you for joining us. I'll begin by giving a quick intro for Courtney. And Courtney M. Leonard is a Shinnecock artist and filmmaker who has contributed to the offshore art movement. In collaboration with national and international museums, cultural institutions, and Indigenous communities in North America, New Zealand, Nova Scotia, and the United States Embassies, Leonard's practice investigates narratives of cultural viability as a reflection of environmental record. Leonard's work is in the permanent public collections of the United States Art and Embassies program, the Crocker Art Museum, Heard Museum, Peabody Essex Museum, and several others. And so again, Courtney, welcome. Thank you. Delighted you could be with us today.
Courtney, thank you for having me.
So let's see, I will start to share our screen again. Great. So maybe actually as an intro to you speaking about your work, you can tell us where you are right now.
I am joining everyone from Dakota Territory in Minnesota, relatively new to the space here. Been here about 6 months.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks. And I will be asking you about all those artworks behind you because it looks like you're in a studio space, but maybe we can start off with the first slide. So of course, the sort of the structure of our conversation today is that we've asked you to choose 3 artworks to talk about and to share with us around the theme of water. So maybe you could start by just kind of introducing this work and telling us what we're looking at.
This piece is called Breach Number 2. And on the side is the relationship of where the work potentially to a certain degree started in 2005. A 40-ton, 50-foot finback whale was struck by a shipping boat, and it's in the Atlantic Ocean, and its carcass had washed ashore on Dune Roadside, which is the inlet that abuts between the Atlantic Ocean and Shinnecock Bay, which then joins our reservation. And it was my first time experience in my life that I had the opportunity to be present with the body of the whale. And the whale in and of itself is extremely significant to our community. Traditionally, one whale would feed ourselves through winter and harsh times. And later, a few years later, I had looked back at this time where our community was not federally recognized, and because of laws and imposition, which is also pertaining to the definition of breach, we were not allowed to take care of the whale or have access to the material of the whale that would be culturally significant for our community to do so. And instead, the town of Southampton spent about $10,000 to cut up the remains of the whale and bury it at a location that we didn't have access to previous to the summer and the Hamptons coming, because the last thing that the community in the Hamptons wants is a rotting whale previous to their enjoyment. So I often will create work that isn't necessarily in a linear time frame. and take an opportunity to look back. And in this regard, the material that I often do have access to and a relationship to for quite some time is that of clay. And so I fashioned the idea of this material cultural conversation into the work of breach number 2, which is 48 to 60 ceramic sperm whale teeth that are signifying one whale, and they are all piled onto this pallet, and it's multiple layers in terms of what actually struck the whale, being that of shipping tends to be the majority of whales killed per year are struck by the shipping industry, and where we get a lot of our products as a society. And then also this idea of having access and accessibility. So there's a lot of different components to it. And I think that it's always important to make work that you continually learn from. And I think that's something that I appreciate also, and also why I choose one word from the English dictionary for labeling the work. It has a little bit of science connotation in terms of how when whales or species are given registration numbers or given some sort of codex, I often look at English as this codex of an imposed language on our community. And within that language, there's multiple different definitions to enter into that word. By offering the word, by offering the definition, I can then offer to the audience a possibility of navigating into the work themselves through the definitions.
Wow, great. Thank you for all of that. Maybe I'll ask you a little bit more about the language and the word parts of it. So, so the title of the series is Breach, and I'm wondering if you could speak to what meanings of that word are important for you around the work, and how you feel like it brings into language some of the visual and conceptual aspects of the work.
Breach is a imposition. It's also a breach of, for instance, breach of contract, breaching the wall. There's a physical component to it. I tend to try to use words that at times can be both a noun or an action. And so breach is an imposition. It's breaching the wall or a gap in the wall. It's also the tail of the whale as it rises through the surface of the water. And in that regard, that component of rising through the water is something that I often think about in terms of what we see as a society and what we don't see as a society. So the species, many species are in consistent life with us. We sometimes don't bear witness to that existence around us until it is immediately in front of us. And so there's a lot of different ways that I enter into breach. And my work for the past over almost to 10 years now has been looking at breach as this entry point into who we are as Shinnecock people, who we have always been historically, and the issues that we're facing today with climate issues, with environmental impact and cultural sustainability and erosion. And so I then started Breach. This piece was a part of the exhibition in 2014, but then I realized I wasn't done looking at the word breach. And so what I started to do was think back to our men who were whalers hired onto the Yankee whaling industry and sailed throughout the world. And when they were on those boats for a long period of time, they would take a document, and they are referred to within a lot of libraries as logbooks, journals per se. And I started to think about this idea of taking my own visual account or journaling of a logbook through the years of observation. And since 2014, I've been doing Breach logbook 2014, 2015, 2016, up to I'm in 2021 now. And by that, I'm able to have the ability to be truly, in my mind, a living artist who isn't framed within one way of working, and I can do a call and response to what's happening in and how I can question. The question that I think about is, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions it? And I started thinking about that in the beginning of Breach, and I still think about it. And I think as we speak or talk to one another, there's some other ways that I've grown and learned from that question.
Wow. I love this idea of a logbook as both a journal and an archive in a sense. It's like a record, but also I think a projection or a sort of understanding in the present as well as an understanding in the past. Do you think of, or are you thinking of a logbook as a sort of, as an archive in a way as well as a journal?
I think, you know, I am very real about where I am and what conversation I'm having. I'm looking at what's happening to us, but I'm having this conversation within the space of art or within this framework. And so when I think about the idea of journaling, it really goes back to acknowledgement, and it goes back to documenting, and it goes back to realizing that often our voices were not considered in these spaces as Indigenous people, and specifically as Shinnecock people. And so before I leave this earth, what can I leave behind that is of significance and acknowledgement for our community and our realities and our truth? And so maybe the language of a logbook is something that others may understand, but my reasoning for it is more coming from who I am as a Shinnecock woman and mother, and just wanting to have a conversation that is human, because these issues are not something that we alone uh, can fix. They weren't made by us. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next image, and maybe I would ask you as a starting point to be thinking about how your understanding of the way that this exploration of the relationship of yourself and the Shinnecock people to climate and to water in particular, and sustainability and access to the things that form you as a community and that you need to survive. Through the almost 10 years you're saying that you've been involved with this logbook project and Breach project, how has your thinking about I guess even framing these questions changed in that time?
So in the notion of call and response, which kind of goes to community songs where you're singing together in unison and working together in unison, I think that the ability to think through Breach and look at what's happening in our environment then leads my response to what the work is. And then also looking at the cultural landscape that I am present in or invited to. Another component of Breach is that I've always felt if you're going to learn about a people, you need to learn from the people themselves. And so I'm very diligent about traveling pre our year, this past year, but traveling to be with the people and be with the community and share who I am as a Shinnecock person, but also learn. And so I've been traveling to, I've been following the path of my ancestors who were on those whaling boats. And I've been up to Mi'kmaq territory, Aotearoa in New Zealand, Alaska, Inupiaq territory. And this particular image is at the Hood Museum, where I was looking at the cultural landscape of the Connecticut River and trying to have an understanding of what happens when one says upriver and then it comes downriver, and what is our connection when the Connecticut River opens up to the Sound and Long Island Sound specifically. And I was there visiting, looking at the collection, and I went to the Wilder Dam, which is a hydro dam in terms of energy needs for that community historically. And that in and of itself is an imposition. And with that notion of imposition, I was looking at this man-made artificial structure, the geometry of that space, the strawberry plants that are actually growing around June, and that for our community is framed around our moon references to Strawberry Moon and June meeting. And I then translated that into forms that were also looking at fish traps and box traps in this kind of geometric way, and the opening up of the dam flow, and then the aqueducts and the pipe systems that also, as the sides of rivers erode, you can see where our wastewater goes to. And in connection to the past 10 years or so, our community, up kind of this time when the spring happens and the waters start to warm, and all of man's infrastructure of runoff and waste is coming into the waters, we have what is called nitrogen runoffs, runoffs and algae blooms. And when that happens, we can't harvest our shellfish. Sometimes they can be toxic to be able to eat. And so there's a period of time and warnings that we have to wait until the shells are safe enough to eat. And that was something that led into past work that I called abundance, the notion of being able to fill your fish basket, but that the fragility of weaving clay into a basket form is not something that will ever actually function to hold fish. And that also had a relationship to the environment, that we couldn't actually function and fill our baskets as well. That series went into a series called Subsistence, which was looking at the box trap forms. And in that regard, I started to I was fortunate to follow a bayman out in Montauk that has his own oyster hatchery, Mike Martinson. And through my residency at the Andy Warhol Preserve on the East End, following him for a few mornings, one morning I saw this ghost trap that was left behind, and this egret that had perched on top of that trap, and this cloud and this haze. And there was some connection between that memory and my space up at the Hood Museum for being present there, that when I started to think about what would this logbook be, then the word nebulous came out. And nebulous was thinking about this cloud or this haze of infrastructure and detritus. And I was able to install this in a very large space. It's hard to tell from the images. And unfortunately, this was right before the air flights and everything shut down during the pandemic. And so people can visit it virtually through a Matterport, or students who are on campus at Dartmouth can also see the exhibition, and they're slowly opening it up to the public. But there is something about building an environment that I have a memory of, and then trying to have that acknowledgement exist for others. So when people walk into this space, the objects are floating around them, above them. They can walk up the stairwell. There is a dual projection playing on the wall, and then sound is incorporated as well. So I really do think about a sensorial experience to try to bring and expand conversations of breach and conversations of these individual logbooks, because I can't tell anybody how to be like, no one can be like Shinnecock unless they're born Shinnecock. So how do I get people to kind of come into the feeling that sometimes we may have in these moments of loss or concern? Those are things I think about when I do these works or installation works. Yeah.
Fantastic. One question I'd like to follow up on is the ghost trap, which is a phrase that you use in describing the piece. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about what a ghost trap is, or what they are, and how they figure into how you've been thinking about this work.
I would probably say this also is the additional layer to the breach number 2 piece that we showed previously, is aside from the species of whales being struck by shipping boats, they're also, as they migrate from the south in kind of the Florida area up north to feed and calve, they sometimes will get caught in crab trap lines, and they're called ghost traps because they're traps that usually either they can't pull the trap up when they're collecting lobster or crabs, and they'll cut the line, and that's left behind. Or it's a damaged trap. There's a lot of different reasons, and there's a lot of different science and research being done with the fisheries to have that not occur for the species of the whales within the past 10 years. So there is an activism to help with this issue, but a ghost trap is something that is left behind, and it just floats around, I guess, like a ghost. Uh,
Mm.
and so I also should acknowledge that the reason why I have pursued the whale as well is because of its cultural significance to our community, but it's also because often people will bear acknowledgement to the issues of a whale more so than they will the issues of indigenous communities. And that was something that I struggled with when I was younger or growing up, is not having your voice be heard and wondering why on so many different layers. And so through my being with the whale, because I have been in other ways, and that sounds a little bit different, but there's this understanding and relationship to being with a species where you both are engaged and learning from one another in terms of how you can support one another. And I think that that is something that weirdly enough I find with working with clay. Is clay is a very it's like being with another human, so you're in a constant relationship with the material. You never know what's going to happen in the future if you keep that relationship. um, so I find parallels with a lot of things that I'm doing. Yeah.
Right, interesting. About 100 ways that I feel like I could respond to that or ask questions around it. And I do want to ask you more about being with the whale, but maybe in just in a couple minutes. I think to stay with this nebulous piece and breach component of breach, looking at this image, and to be clear for the folks who are listening, the work is presented in the exhibition Form and Relation, which is at the Hood Museum, Dartmouth College. Looking at this work, one thing that really strikes me is how just like beautiful it is. It's very chromatic. It's kind of luscious. You have this sort of rich, saturated colors of the paint. It's beautiful in many ways. And I'm wondering what for you is the role of beauty or sort of visual seduction in your work, and in this piece in particular, considering that you are, part of it involves this kind of notion of ghost or sort of something almost being haunted or left behind, as well as the environmental impact, not just of whaling, but of damming rivers and the kind of runoff and all of those impacts. How do you think about making something beautiful or not beautiful?
Well, I really love the surfaces of these works, and I started to frame them within the notion of beautiful decay. And there's this intimacy that I realize when I walk the shoreline. And I sometimes, when I was down in Florida for another research component, I had walked the shore and there was a crab trap that was buried in the sand and it was left behind. And when you come up towards something and you spend time with it and you zoom in, and I'll often use my phone to walk on hikes with and really zoom in on the image, uh, there are so many beautiful layers of beauty and decay that occurs in the rust and the surface of that trap that has also lived and journeyed. And you can see that as well in the larvae that attach of oysters or mussels on docks. When I was specifically looking at the color references for this, I was thinking back to this nebulous. I was thinking about when you're in the deep part of the water swimming and you want to swim up to the light, that blue tonality that I was choosing was looking back at those memories of flickering through that space.
Mm.
And then when I was looking at the Wilder Dam, the orangey rusty hues that it imbued was what led me into doing these surfaces that are of multiple glazes. And so I don't think, previous to really reflecting on this particular space, when I have the opportunity to do installations they are framed in honoring the space that I am honored to be in. And so I often make completely new work in that call and response. I don't think I would ever have chosen these colors previous to doing, you know, I never really was fond of orange or lime greens or those tones, but wow, when I was sitting with these surfaces through multiple ways, it brought me back to walking that shoreline and looking at those moments of beautiful decay. So I think sometimes when people have conversations of beauty, it needs to be like a bit more wholesome of all of the components of how life affords beauty, even within death. And that's something that I think we can forget. We can sometimes weigh something as being positive or the other thing as being negative. But if we're really going to have this conversation about beauty, we have to look at it as a whole in terms of our life experiences. So yeah, I love these surfaces. Yeah.
It makes me think of the image of you standing by the whale at the beginning in the first slide too, as being sort of within that broader sense of beauty. I think another aspect of this project that I really love is and you reference this a bit with the idea of sort of the lightness of the blue of coming up into the water, sort of coming up on the surface. And there's a sort of destabilized relationship of where our bodies are relative to the water, say being within the water versus outside of the water. And you mentioned earlier in the conversation around the idea of sort of coming face to face with something, but not seeing it, and sort of being in the water kind of, in a way, being its own world, or being a world that on some level is fundamentally connected to, yet distinct from the world that as humans we occupy most of the time, being on the land and breathing. So I'm wondering in this piece, thinking about sort of the consciousness of water and and when certain aspects of that are visible or come into awareness, when we have and access, I guess, is the other thought that you brought into the conversation, what we as individuals or as communities have access to. And so in what you were speaking about was not having access to a whale, say, your community, but when you're inside the water, what do you have access to? What opens up and what's present there?
When I specifically am in the water, I'm probably in one of my most joyous spaces, in all honesty. Definitely salt water is truly healing. But water, we're born into water. There's so many correlations to, I mean, we are water. Like
Yeah.
it's, it's just something that for me is truly healing, but it's also truly powerful, because our community, we are in a territory, traditional territory, not removed from our traditional areas. Uh, when when we potentially may have a future hurricane that is above a 6, our land will be potentially covered by water, and so sometimes you have to really, sometimes you don't have a choice in your relationship to water, and what it can remind you of, in both that kind of being born into it way, in a healing way, but also to a certain degree in a destructive way, in a lot of different fashions. So, and then also how we as a society, I didn't talk about per se that another component of this work kind of goes back to a previous logbook that I had looked at in California with trade routes called intermodal, and the intermodality of import and export, but how we import and export water through our piping systems, and how many of those piping systems are metals or plastics, and traditionally within the US and other societies, there were red clay pipes. And so what I would do at times was take PVC pipes, recast them into red clay, and then have these clusters of oysters coming out of those units to kind of give this acknowledgement of traditional indigenous knowledge that we already had in terms of the filtration oysters being able to offset contaminations within water spaces, and then kind of bringing that knowledge back. And it's something that we've just become a bit, I mean, not a bit, we've become quite lazy as a society in terms of what we want to invest in and what we don't want to invest in, because the knowledge is already there. So how do you have these conversations where, if I want to have the joy of swimming in water, what can I do to protect it? If I'm going to have those moments where my subsistence relates to being able to have healthy waters, what am I going to do to acknowledge that space, bring awareness so that we stop or cease our immense use of this honor to have access and the ability to be with water. And I also think about when we talk more about notions of consent today as a society. It took quite some time for people to start having these conversations, but what is the consent of water? And those are things that I often think of as well. And I do acknowledge I'm not an environmental artist at all. I do think that these are conversations we don't have about, if you're not harvesting your own clay locally, you're a part of an extraction system. And so I do acknowledge that within the materiality of how I am using materials within spaces, for instance, the acrylic on these walls. And that also is something that if I were to be able to have time to truly afford it, the DuPont mansion historically was our bay neighbor for where my grandma's allotment is on the reservation. And if anybody's familiar with DuPont or larger companies, they were the beginning manufacturers of plastics and paint. And previous to that knowledge, the plasticity of whale baleen was something that was used for corsets and also oil from the whale. So there's a lot of correlations between how I think about concept, documentation, water, space, relation, past, present, and futurism.
I want to stay with, I love this idea of the consent of water. And I think I want to think about that for a long time, but I also want to think about it right now for a bit. And so I'm from New York and New England, and I've spent a fair amount of time on Eastern Long Island and lived in Connecticut before moving to Toronto. And one of the things that has stood out to me coming to the Great Lakes region is that the relationship to water is really, really different here than it is on the coast and in Connecticut and in New England, certainly. And it seems to me that the water, like the just sort of geographically and relationally, the water here is sort of perforated. It's like it's everywhere in a way. There are these very large lakes, of course, so close to Lake Ontario, but then there's like water sort of comes up everywhere. And for me, the distinction is on the, say on Long Island or in Shinnecock territory, you have like this massive ocean that it kind of confronts you. And so there's a different sort of relationship of a single mass or of a large entity of water versus water as a sort of perforating the ground and surrounding you. You mentioned at the beginning that you're in Dakota territory right now, and I'm wondering if you're finding that the relationship to water there is different than in your homeland.
So I'm always mindful not to speak about things I don't know. So I've only been here for 6 months.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I have to honestly say, aside from teaching, I have been very mindful of protecting myself and my family at this time. So I haven't really had an opportunity to venture out in a safe way where I can develop that relationship to be able to speak on it just yet. So I'm looking forward to it. I can say the difference just being present in this space, having lived in New Mexico for about 10 years previous to living here, is every place you go, it's going to teach you in a different way. The light hits differently in different spaces. But the presence of water, even within a desert and land space, it is still one that teaches you. You either don't take huge baths if you're on well water. And you're super mindful of what that's like in your studio space. And then you carry that knowledge elsewhere too. But here, lots of snow, lots of rain. I really love the migration of the birds here. So there's these, when we first moved here in August, red-winged blackbirds were out perched on the cattails in the local ponds. And that was a beautiful memory for me because they're my birds back home in Shinnecock. And so I kind of felt, I think, a bit more at home with this transition. But then I also found home when I was living in New Mexico as well, because that place used to be an ocean. And so you can go hiking and find historical acknowledgements of bivalves and fossils, or teeth from sharks. And so it takes a little bit of understanding on an individual part as to one's connection to water and place. But I'm still on my learning journey, so I don't.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. As we all are, I would say, for sure. Yeah. Let us speak about the third image that you're sharing with us. So again, maybe start by we have this great picture of Deb Haaland, I believe, and maybe you can tell us a bit about this work and what some of the questions are.
So this piece is Breach Logbook 21, and it's Scrimshaw Study 1. And I will often continue to fashion this conversation of sperm whale teeth out of clay in different ways, whether I coil everything first. I love the process of coiling, find it to be quite calming. And this particular piece is made from micaceous clay that is from New Mexico, from a store there. And it kind of ties into other works that I've done, looking at coastal erosion and having a conversation about mining and extraction, where the clay itself is kind of sourced local, red clay from New Mexico, but the micaceous component comes from China. And I think sometimes in ceramics, when people want to, just to give the audience a bit of history to micaceous clay, it tends to, within ceramics, have a historical relationship to Southwest Pueblo communities, because they would use that clay for cooking and temperware, and still do today. So when tourism goes to New Mexico, on occasion, when they want to learn how to do traditional indigenous pottery, they will seek those trips out, and they will maybe buy this bag of clay thinking that that authenticity is like purchased within that framework to then do it. But they haven't harvested themselves, and they may not have asked their question of like, where did it actually come from? So I tend to use that clay body on occasion, and a bit of it is from New Mexico. Deb Haaland is Laguna Pueblo. For our future indigenous people, and specifically my daughter, her presence and her activism has meant a lot to us. And my daughter's 9. So to see your presence in some sort of way through the lens of someone else is powerful, and her work for communities has been powerful. And so her nomination is what is actually here. The image is the first acceptance of her nomination to be the Secretary of the Interior for the Department of the Interior. And that encompasses a lot of environmental and political issues and frameworks and caretaking within the US. When I was looking back this past year, thinking about this logbook, when I do 2021, it's usually between 2020 and it's usually between the previous year and the current year. Looking back at this pandemic, there has been a bit of resiliency for whales, calving and breaching within the Hudson River. There was an article in December 2020 where people could see the whale tails breach in the Hudson River. And there were a few calving birth rates that increased for northern right whales, which are on potentially on the endangered species list on and off. And so, so this piece is acknowledging that presence of where we are today, our past notions of futurism, matriarchy, passed down knowledge between the mother calf and the baby calf, and then also this kind of immigration or migration of cultural, like cross-cultural engagement. So I was looking at Delftware and thinking about Dutch Delftware and colonial impact, which was something I did for my graduate studies. Was I was looking at Dutch Delftware and Algonquin correlations, and I traveled to the Netherlands at the time. But the work that I made at that point in time 10 years ago was something where the notion of blue and white is very prevalent within this material within Western society. But the other component that I really wanted to bring in was like for our community, it's the purple and white of the quahog shells. So this is kind of a combination of the layers of almost the wallpaper of historical relations, and ripped apart and weathered and layered and present. So that's really what scrimshaw teeth were. It was a time to be on that ship looking and carving a narrative that you would share maybe with your loved one, or a gift to a family, some sort of documentation. And so when I weave back into different bodies of work, whether it's artifice or subsistence or the scrimshaw or breach number 2, I really do relate it to what's happening today, and sometimes it's still happening. So the series is ongoing, it's not quite complete. So this is the newest one, and we cried the other day when all those votes came in. It's like, you know, you kind of knew it was going to happen, but then for Indigenous people, you don't have enough time to have the expectation that it's going to happen. So when it does happen, wow, you're just like, wow, it really happened. So so at this point in time, then it's all on us as a society to continue to help, because it's not Deb Haaland. We all have to work on these issues and support one another. But I would never have imagined an Indigenous woman being in that space, and I will do my best to support in a continued way. So that's this piece, and this piece is actually I'm honored it's going to the Met for a new exhibition framework. So it's actually in Manhattan now, and it was a way for me to think about acknowledging Indigenous presence as best as that I could. I hold a lot of responsibility to what I make, so this piece is, for me, I hope for many other people, significant.
Thank you. That's such a great way of, such an incredible way of framing it. And yeah, I think so moving. I love also how you have this combination that you've spoken to of the blue and white and the purple and white as well. Really fantastic. I'd love to draw out one other, to pick up on one thing that you spoke to earlier a bit, which was the notion of clay being like a person in a way, sort of is a way of thinking about clay, or as the material as being alive and having you've written in the past about it having a soul or a spirit, potentially, and about approaching the medium in that way as a kind of living being that you engage with and have an ongoing relationship with. I think another point of entry for a number of folks into this sort of set of ideas is through the idea of vibrant matter, just a notion proposed by Jane Bennett, a scholar and cultural historian, which is related in the sense that matter or things or sort of materials have this kind of vibrancy or resonance where they talk back to us, and it's a give and take in an interactive relationship. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, either in this piece or more broadly, about the clay as a living material, and how you feel like that sort of conversation with the material has an impact in the work or comes through in the work.
Well, when we're buried, we go back to the earth.
Yeah, right. It's us.
And not just us, but everything. So we're working with something that is a lived material through time and fashioning it in a way that I think, I mean, it's hard to frame it for others because I think it comes from how one is raised or maybe one's cultural understanding of relation. But I think that it's never been something that I've been not be like I can't have the idea or the philosophy that I am not engaged with another entity that is living. It is, and I think that is something too about going back to that notion of responsibility. It's like before you transition clay from being in one state to another and you fire it per se, it can never be reclaimed out of that state. So you're making a commitment to what it may live with or live as. And then when it lives in that fashion, then it holds energy in a different way. And I think that that's something I often love. I'm honored to have the work of anyone, but usually even if I have a mug that's filled with coffee, I tend not to use the handles. I really love how clay holds heat and holds space and holds energy, holds memory. You're touching the material. So when I was younger and I was going to places that were private collections that held shards from our traditional pottery in those spaces, I love seeing the imprints of a thumb, and that was something that I think it was interesting to be in college learning ceramics. You know, I went to Alfred for my undergrad in ceramics, and I went to RISD for my master's. And then just being in art, sometimes you'll maybe see a painter who their signature is larger than the painting itself, and that was never something that I quite understood, because the notion of a maker's mark doesn't necessarily need a signature. The signature is in your conversation and in that relationship of touch within this material kind of call and response. So that's another thing about my work. I don't sign any of it. So I just kind of feel like, you know, go ahead if you think that, you know, there's a question about who made this per se, but I also think that it's not about who made it. It's about breach as being this extended conversation of everyone. So who am I to sign my signature on something that isn't my own to hold? So I think that goes back to maybe conversations that should be thought of more in terms of ownership, consent, ownership, authority. Yeah. So so yeah, I think at one point in time somebody will be, you know, in a weird way, we're all coiling one another. And then if you think about, I sometimes I just look at material in different ways. So I've done installations where I've incorporated crushed coal, and that was looking at energy, looking at the impact of energy too, because up until recently, coal has really offset a lot of communities, not just indigenous communities, but the history of our society in relationship to coal. But then coal being this compressed organic material that may have been that of the whale. And so when we look back at time and material relationship, maybe that notion of one another, like, and then maybe it's an ego thing to even say that clay is like a human. Like, I don't think that, I don't think calling clay a human, you know, maybe we're all clay.
Right,
So,
right. Like it doesn't elevate it to call it a human, like it elevates us to call
I
us
think
clay.
we have to be cautious of what it is that we say. But the meaning should be there. The relation should be there. Yeah.
And the consent, as you're saying too. Yeah. We have time for one more question, and we've been. I think I'm going to exit us from the slideshow, because we've been speaking this whole time, and you're in a studio, you have some artwork behind you, and clearly you work in a broader palette than just ceramics. So I'm wondering if we could close off by you telling us a bit about the work that you have at hand now that's underway, or what's behind you.
Yeah, our studio's in Red Wing, and I'm working, so it was really hard for me after I did the Nebulous exhibition, which the research extended beyond a year. It was deeply invested with the Hood community for form and relation. And uh, after that, and flying back home and living with this time, like I said, I don't talk about things I don't know. And so and I still kind of don't know what this is. And so I had a pause on what I didn't make anything for quite some time. And so when we transitioned to Minnesota and found this space, rather than going into the clay first, I started to go into some paintings. And I was looking at, and I think this is kind of just like a weird thought. I was thinking about maybe not surviving this pandemic,
Mm.
and what would I be leaving behind, and what does it mean to like worry about death. So I was looking at whales in a different way, and also I Googled Shinnecock art, and it was unfortunate that what came up was like William Merritt Chase's paintings and the Shinnecock School, and so that made me think of looking at this notion of who gets to document whose landscape, and how that documentation exists. And so these pieces are my Collider series, and they're looking at whale fall and the skeletons of whales. This particular whale is hanging in New Hampshire. Its name is Tofu. It was hit by a shipping boat. It's a juvenile humpback. I painted it onto the surface, and then to kind of think about the Merritt Chase paintings. On occasion, he tended to use reds to navigate the viewer within the composition. So you'll find these little moments of reds in his paintings. That was the only part I really wanted to take from that. I didn't really want to remake someone else's paintings. So these are poppies, and they're kind of overlaid with medicine knowledge, living through a pandemic where we're trying to find vaccines and new knowledge, thinking about indigenous knowledge and medicines, the whale being something of healing to a community as well. So it's layered a few ways, but I work in threes. So there's another one there.
Oh, wow.
And these are about 60 by 72 inches. And they're my current works in progress called Collider 1, 2, and 3. And the word collider was looking at this ion collider that just opened up in terms of physics and energy in Brookhaven on Long Island, and just thinking about how we as a society, as humans, dive into things of the unknown to then know, but who's to say that that might not be like something that we should tread lightly with. So that's this series, and I'll work in multiples, because if anybody knows about the relationship with clay, you have to let something sit to then kind of shift through. And I often am worried about time, so I'll just keep myself going. So I have the clay coiled and work on a painting and just kind of don't stop.
Back and forth. Excellent.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm so glad that we incorporated these other three works into our three works. That's really great. And William Merritt Chase and like the Brookhaven Collider coming together in your paintings. It's brilliant. So thank you for that. And thank you for being here. Thanks for spending the time. It's really been an honor to speak with you and to learn more about your work.
Yeah. Tabutni, thank you. It's really been an honor, because I know, social media and we've seen one another, but not really. So this is great.
Right. This is what we can do these days, is have like Zoom conversations.
And then hopefully at some point in time, travel will be better, and I look forward to connecting with you in person in the future. So yeah, thank you.
Likewise. Be well in the meantime. continue making great work. And thanks to everyone who's been joining us. Keep your eyes out on the Gardener. We have some upcoming talks, some virtual talks, so please join those. So thank you again and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.